September 1968, London. Frances Spencer, Viscountess Althorp, is in court fighting for her 4 children. Her marriage to John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, had already ended in any practical sense more than a year earlier. She had left in 1967 and taken her 2 youngest children, Diana, then 6, and Charles, then 3, to London. That Christmas, Althorp refused to let the children return to London with their mother. It was the pivot point. He intended to fight for custody, and he had the resources and the social standing to make the fight serious. By April 1968, the matter had become public in the worst possible way. Janet Shand Kydd, wife of the man Frances had left her husband for, sued for divorce and named Frances in the adultery filing. Open court, newspaper coverage, moral damage done. When Frances went before a judge in September 1968 seeking custody of Sarah, Jane, Diana, and Charles Spencer, she was already fighting from weakened ground. Then Lady Ruth Fermoy, her own mother, took the stand against her. Frances lost. John Spencer retained custody of all 4 children. The divorce was made absolute on 2 May 1969. Frances married Peter Shand Kydd the same day, having surrendered the children she'd gone to court to keep. She never publicly forgave what her mother did in that courtroom. The rupture between them was total and permanent. Diana was 7 years old. She would spend the rest of her childhood knowing that her grandmother had chosen the institution over her mother. That is the first thing to understand about Ruth Roche, Baroness Fermoy. The second is that she spent 33 years as one of the Queen Mother's most trusted courtiers and closest personal friends. And the third, more contested, more carefully sourced, but more consequential, is that she may also have helped position this same daughter Diana for the most consequential royal marriage of the 20th century, and then privately warned her granddaughter not to go through with it. The woman who could hold all 3 of those things simultaneously was born Ruth Sylvia Gill on 2nd October 1908 at Dalhebody House in Beeldside, Aberdeenshire, Scotland. Her father was Colonel William Smith Gill, her mother Ruth, née Little John, the daughter of a Scottish justice of the peace. The family were wealthy landowners, comfortable and established, the kind of Scottish gentry that produced daughters who trained in Europe and then married well. Ruth trained exceptionally. By the 1920s, she was at the Conservatoire de Paris, studying piano under Alfred Cortot, one of the most significant pianists and pedagogues in Europe at that time. Her obituary in The Independent would describe her as an accomplished concert pianist. One biographical account notes simply that she was a pianist at the Paris Conservatoire, but without much hesitation she gave up her career to marry Maurice, who was attractive to women. Maurice Burke Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy, was born in 1885. His mother had been Frances Ellen Work, a New York heiress whose father, Frank Work, was a multi-millionaire stockbroker, which is where some of Diana's American family lineage actually originates, through the Roche line, not through Ruth Gill herself. Ruth was Scottish-born, Scottish-raised, and entirely British in her origins. Maurice had initially become an American citizen under pressure from his grandfather's inheritance conditions, but he ignored those conditions, returned to England, succeeded to the Fermoy barony in 1920, and resumed British nationality. He served as Conservative MP for King's Lynn in 2 stints, 1924 to 1935 and 1943 to 1945. They married on 17 September 1931 at St. Devenick's Church, Beeldside. Reception at Dalhebody House. She was 22, he was 45. 3 children followed: Mary Cynthia in 1934, Frances Ruth in 1936, and Edmund James Burke in 1939. Frances, Diana's mother, was born at Park House on the Royal Sandringham estate on 20th January 1936. Maurice had rented Park House from the royal family. The proximity was residential rather than ceremonial. The Fermoy family simply lived there, on the same Norfolk estate where the royal family spent significant time. Maurice had befriended King George VI through the Sandringham shooting seasons. Maurice died in July 1955 after collapsing in a King's Lynn shop. After her husband's death, the path from Park House to the Queen Mother's household was short. In 1956, the Queen Mother appointed Lady Fermoy Extra Woman of the Bedchamber. 4 years later, she was promoted to Woman of the Bedchamber, a position that meant accompanying the Queen Mother on official and private engagements, maintaining her calendar, handling correspondence, spending extended time at Clarence House, Royal Lodge, and on private holidays to France and Italy. She held it for 33 years until her death. The formal honors accumulated in parallel: OBE in 1952, CVO in 1966, DCVO in 1979. The friendship between Fermoy and the Queen Mother ran deeper than any job title. A surviving 1980 letter written on Clarence House stationery and signed Ruth Fermoy, Lady-in-Waiting, conveys the Queen Mother's thanks for 80th birthday congratulations. Purely administrative, but it exists as a document, which is more than most evidence from this friendship does. At some point in the 1970s, when Sandringham was undergoing renovation, the Queen Mother stayed at Fermoy's own London home. That is friendship with a specific texture, not a professional arrangement. One source describes how it was whispered in the corridors of Buckingham that Lady Fermoy was more royalist than the Queen. Hugo Vickers's biography of the Queen Mother describes their relationship as among the closest. One account puts the duration of the friendship at more than 60 years until Lady Fermoy's death, measured from before the formal appointment, going back to the Norfolk social world they shared in the 1940s, and the King's Lynn Festival connection. Ruth Fermoy founded the King's Lynn Festival in 1951, 5 years before her formal appointment. It gave professional expression to the concert pianist she had set aside when she married. She persuaded the Queen Mother to become its patron. The festival still holds an annual Ruth, Lady Fermoy Memorial Concert in her honor, which recognizes the musician rather than the courtier. It's the version of her legacy that doesn't depend on royal access. Her access to everything that followed, though, depended on it entirely. The question of what Lady Fermoy actually did in connection with the Wales courtship requires 2 separate tracks because the historical record contains 2 different kinds of evidence, and they don't resolve into the same answer. The first track is press consensus. At the time of her death in July 1993, the Los Angeles Times called her Diana's maternal grandmother and matchmaker, and described her as considered the matchmaker along with the Queen Mother. The UPI Wire described her as widely credited with helping arrange the marriage. A genealogist named Brooks Baker, quoted in the UPI obituary, stated, "Certainly it's accepted that she was the main influence behind the marriage." Baker also reported that Fermoy had described telling the Queen Mother their families should unite, though this appears in a single source, characterized as what she used to say, not a documented conversation. Lady Fermoy's own response to the matchmaking assumption, attributed to the Associated Press on the day after her death: "You can say that if you like, but it simply wouldn't be true." The second track is what the biographers found when they looked for documented actions. Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story, sourced from Diana's own tapes, centers on the custody betrayal and the private warning as Fermoy's most significant acts. It doesn't present her as a conscious architect, engineering specific introductions. Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography of Charles places the decisive institutional pressure on Prince Philip, who reportedly sent a written ultimatum: propose or end the relationship before Diana's reputation was further damaged by prolonged speculation. In Dimbleby's account, the palace machinery and Philip drove the engagement to its conclusion. Fermoy is peripheral. Sally Bedell Smith in Diana in Search of Herself describes Fermoy as a conventional class-bound matriarch, but doesn't produce a documented meeting she arranged, a letter she wrote lobbying officials, or a named participant who described her as the one who put Diana in front of Charles. No such primary document exists in any accessible source. No dated letter, no meeting record, no contemporaneous witness account with a named source establishes that she engineered specific steps. What the structural picture does show: a family that had lived on the Sandringham estate for decades, a grandmother who spent 33 years as a senior figure in the Queen Mother's household, a granddaughter who had grown up knowing the royal family, playing as a child with Prince Andrew and Prince Edward on the same estate, comfortable at Balmoral in ways that were legible and reassuring to the family she was being considered for. Diana wasn't a stranger arriving from outside. She was already a known quantity within royal circles, partly because of her family's sustained proximity, and Lady Fermoy was a significant part of what had built and maintained that proximity over 30 years. Whether that constitutes engineering a marriage or simply existing in the same social world at the right moment is a distinction the available evidence can't close. One specific clarification matters here: the public assurance of Diana's virginity before the wedding. Diana, I can assure you, has never had a lover, came from Lord Fermoy, which was Edmund Roach, Ruth Fermoy's son and Diana's uncle, not Lady Fermoy herself. Two different people, two different statements. The conflation turns up in popular coverage occasionally, and it matters to get right, because it attributes to the grandmother a specific and notorious act that actually belongs to the son. Tina Brown in The Diana Chronicles describes Fermoy as a scheming grandmother. Her later book, The Palace Papers, applies the phrase genteel viper. Tim Clayton and Phil Craig's Diana, Story of a Princess, calls her one of the minor villains of the Diana story. These are retrospective characterizations, reflecting biographical consensus about her complicity in the conditions that led to the marriage. None of them constitute primary proof of specific engineering. Together, they describe what the record actually shows: a woman positioned at every structural intersection that would have made influence easy, who publicly denied exercising it, whose denial sits alongside the assumption without either being definitively proved. Back to September 1968. The custody testimony is the most clearly documented action she took, and it reveals a character pattern that runs across the rest of her life. The biographical accounts offer several overlapping explanations for why Fermoy testified against her own daughter. She is described consistently as holding a firm belief in the sanctity of marriage. Frances had committed adultery and left her husband. The man she'd left for, Peter Shand Kydd, had made his money in the wallpaper trade, which placed him in a social category Fermoy found unacceptable. One account describes her as appalled that her daughter had run off with a man in trade. The book, Ever After, Diana and the Life She Led, states she convinced Johnny to fight his wife for custody, and that any loyalty to her daughter was put aside in the interests of privilege and social cachet. All of these explanations overlap without a clear hierarchy. What they collectively describe is a woman who, when personal loyalty and institutional values were in direct conflict, chose institutional values. It wasn't a one-time aberration. The same pattern would reappear when the Wales marriage began to fracture. She aligned with Charles, with the royal household, with the side of the institution. Just as Sally Bedell-Smith notes explicitly, drawing the parallel between her 1968 position and her 1990s position. The court records themselves are sealed. No verbatim transcript of Fermoy's testimony is publicly available. What the sources, the Times obituary, the Wikipedia entry sourced to the Times, the Francis Shand Kydd Wikipedia page, Clayton and Craig's Diana, uniformly describe is the same event. Lady Fermoy testified against Francis, allowing Viscount Althorp to retain custody. The testimony was directed at Francis's fitness as a parent, supporting the father's claim. Diana was among the 4 children whose fate was being determined. Fermoy's testimony was against Diana's mother, not against Diana. Diana grew up in the custody that testimony helped determine. She would later marry into the institution her grandmother served. The lines between 1968 and 1981 aren't difficult to trace. Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story, was published on 16 June 1992. At the time of publication, Buckingham Palace stated Diana had not cooperated in any way whatsoever. The book was based on hours of secret tape-recorded testimony, recorded in 1991 and 1992, by Diana answering questions submitted by Morton and conveyed through Dr. James Colthurst, who cycled into Kensington Palace with a concealed recorder, received her answers, and carried the tapes back. Morton didn't acknowledge Diana as his primary source until after her death in 1997, in the expanded edition, Diana, Her True Story, in her own words. Page 55 of the original 1992 edition carries the most cited Fermoy quotation in the entire record. According to Morton's account, Diana recalled a warning from her grandmother before the wedding. "Darling, you must understand that their sense of humor and their lifestyle are different, and I don't think it will suit you." The sourcing chain stated plainly. Lady Fermoy allegedly said this to Diana at some point before July 1981. Diana remembered it. Diana recorded it on tape in 1991 or 1992, describing it to Colthurst as part of her testimony about her marriage and the circumstances surrounding it. Colthurst brought the tape to Morton. Morton published it in June 1992. Morton acknowledged Diana as his source in 1997. Both Fermoy and Diana were dead by then. No letter, no diary, no contemporaneous third-party account corroborates the conversation. The entire record of the warning is a private exchange recalled by one participant, recorded approximately a decade later, published by a biographer who didn't identify his source for 5 years. What makes the claim widely credited despite its thin documentary provenance is the surrounding context. Royal biographer Kate Williams, discussing this period on the Daily Mail's Queens, Kings, and Dastardly Things podcast, described Fermoy as one of the only dissenting voices before the wedding. The broader picture is of an engagement in which almost everyone around Diana was caught up in the romance of the match. Diana's older sisters, Lady Sarah and Lady Jane, when she expressed doubt, reportedly responded, using her childhood nickname, "Bad luck, Dutch, your face is on the tea towels, you can't go back." Against that backdrop, a 60-something-year-old woman who understood the institution from the inside, warning her granddaughter that the fit wasn't right, isn't just plausible. It's consistent with a woman who had spent 3 decades watching how the royal household actually worked, as opposed to how it appeared from the outside. The timing of the warning remains unclear. Sources say before the wedding or before she married. One version places it the night before the ceremony, but that specific detail appears only in lower authority retellings and doesn't appear in Morton's primary account. The safest reading of the available evidence is, at some point during the engagement period, between February and July 1981, Lady Fermoy told Diana privately that she had doubts. She then attended the wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral on 29 July 1981 as the grandmother of the bride. Nearly 1 billion television viewers watched. The Archbishop of Canterbury described the ceremony as the stuff of which fairy tales are made. Lady Fermoy sat in her pew and watched. Whatever she said in private, she showed an entirely different face in public. The warning and the attendance are both part of the record, and they don't resolve into a single, coherent verdict on what she thought or intended. After the wedding, Lady Fermoy's allegiances became easier to document. When the Wales marriage began fracturing publicly in the late 1980s and early 1990s, she aligned with the royal household and with Charles. Bedell Smith draws the explicit parallel in Diana in Search of Herself. Fermoy took Prince Charles's side as she had with Johnny during the marital breakdown. The same structural choice, the same institutional preference, a generation apart. The pattern held. Morton's biography suggests Diana sought some form of reconciliation with her grandmother in the period before Fermoy's death, that she simply decided to confront the woman who had hurt her so badly, and that meetings between them did lead to a truce between the two warring relations. Multiple other sources report Fermoy and Diana weren't on speaking terms at the time of Fermoy's death. Both accounts may be partly accurate, or one of them may be wrong. Primary documentation that would settle the question definitively doesn't exist, and the people who would know are dead. When Morton's book appeared in June 1992, Lady Fermoy was 83 years old and still formally serving as Woman of the Bedchamber. She gave no interviews. She made no public statements that survive. She maintained her court position through the most acute phase of the Wales public breakdown without any visible disruption to her institutional role. The formal separation was announced by Prime Minister John Major on 9 December 1992. 6 months after the separation, Lady Fermoy died at her home at 36 Eaton Square, London, on 6 July 1993, aged 84. Cause of death described only as after a brief illness. Her funeral was held at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster. She was buried in the Fermoy family vault at St. Martin's Church, Sandringham, the same Sandringham where Francis had been born in 1936, where Diana had played as a child, where the whole long arc of this family's proximity to royalty had first taken root. The Wales divorce wasn't finalized until August 1996. Diana died in Paris in August 1997. Lady Fermoy missed both endings by more than 3 years. She died knowing the marriage had collapsed publicly, the separation announced, the Morton books damage done, the Charles and Camilla tapes already leaked, but she didn't see the legal dissolution or the tunnel in Paris. She saw the unraveling and was gone before the end. In the 3 decades since her death, history has treated Lady Fermoy with a consistent and revealing indifference. She appears in every significant Diana biography. She is the subject of almost none. The characterizations across those accounts share a consistent register. Minor villain in Clayton and Craig. Conventional class-bound matriarch in Bedell Smith. Scheming grandmother in the Diana Chronicles. Genteel viper in the Palace Papers. Stalwart member of the court of Queen Elizabeth in her own Times of London obituary. Each is partial. Together they describe a person who was complicit in certain outcomes without being the primary documented driver of any of them. The Crown, Season 4, gave her a larger footprint, played by Georgie Glenn as an imperious royal etiquette coach preparing Diana for Windsor life. Multiple fact-checking pieces published at the time of the season were unanimous. That specific depiction was heavily dramatized and not supported by documented evidence. The formal coaching scenes, the precise chaperoning of early meetings between Charles and Diana, these appear in a French-language secondary source and in television drama, but not in the authoritative biographies. What television needed was visible action. The actual record is quieter. The most dedicated single-channel treatment of Fermoy as a biographical subject at the scale of YouTube coverage is the Regal Chronicles video. Princess Diana's maternal grandmother, Ruth Roche, Baroness Fermoy, with approximately 16,000 views. For a woman who spent 33 years in the Queen Mother's household, founded a music festival that still bears her name, and occupied one of the most consequential positions in the social architecture of the Wales marriage, that's a thin historical footprint. Part of the gap is her own construction. She wrote no memoir. She gave no significant interviews. The most directly attributed public statement that survives is her 1993 denial to the Associated Press. You can say that if you like, but it simply wouldn't be true. The woman who spent 3 decades inside the institution that prizes discretion above almost everything else apparently carried that discretion to the end. The private woman who testified against her daughter in 1968, who may have warned her granddaughter in 1981, who aligned with the palace when the marriage finally collapsed, that woman left almost no primary documentation. What we have is the pattern visible from watching the external choices over decades. A woman who consistently prioritized institutional loyalty over personal loyalty, except possibly once, quietly, in a conversation that left no trace except Diana's memory of it. Ruth Roche, Lady Fermoy, died on 6 July 1993, 7 months after watching the marriage come apart. She never saw the divorce. She never saw Diana's death. She said nothing publicly throughout. History has mostly filed her as supporting cast in someone else's tragedy, but she held a genuinely unusual position. 3 decades inside the Queen Mother's inner circle, a granddaughter who would become the most photographed woman in the world, and, according to Diana's own account on tape, published by Andrew Morton, a private warning delivered before a wedding that she then attended and watched proceed. She was right about what she warned Diana against. The lifestyle and the humor weren't a fit. The marriage lasted 11 years before the formal separation. It wasn't what it appeared to be from the outside, which was apparently what she told Diana it wouldn't be. What Lady Fermoy believed she had done to contribute to that outcome, and whether she carried regret for it, and what passed between her and Diana in those final months before her death. None of that is in any document. The silence is total. It has lasted 30 years.